Today we're going to pick up our story and bring ourselves to the end of the Civil War. And keep in mind, the Civil War is a topic that is so vast that whole courses are taught on it. And so we're just giving you the briefest of overviews so you sort of understand why the war, how the war unfolded, and why the war unfolded the way that it did. So, when we last left our heroes, in the West, Grant was having some success. He had captured the Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers, thereby giving the North a monopoly on transport east and west across the South. But the South was still holding their own in Virginia, and both Northern and Southern society were being transformed by the large-scale and brutal, devastating nature of the war. But at this point, the North more or less has the upper hand. They can resupply their troops at will. They have this new sort of structure where they're printing money and they're increasing their industrial capacity, whereas the South is being squeezed and constricted by northern blockades and by pressure and the fact that they just simply don't have the industrial base that the North has. And so the Battle of Gettysburg represents Lee's really last chance to try to force a negotiated settlement on the North. Obviously, the North is far more industrially capable, and therefore there's no way that the South could invade and subjugate the North. But if they could win a decisive battle, especially before the election of 1864, they could potentially allow a pro-peace candidate to win and then maybe have a negotiated settlement. So Lee invades Pennsylvania in order to try to potentially threaten Philadelphia or maybe even Washington, D.C. And he comes to battle with the Union General George Meade at a place called Gettysburg, which is an important rail junction. A couple important things here. Meade is able to take the high ground, which allows him to defend more effectively against Lee's attacks. And so therefore, charging uphill the Southern Army is at a significant disadvantage. And so the battle lasts for several days, with Lee attempting to break through Meade's lines and Meade being able to move troops in or having sort of heroic last stands from units in order to hold the Southerners off long enough to reinforce these lines. And the climactic final moment is what's called Pickett's Charge, and it's a massive cavalry charge sort of into the center of the lines. Lee was hoping to potentially split the Union Army and then get around behind them and potentially roll them up and rout them. And so they're attacking here along Cemetery Ridge. But the Northerners are able to hold, and Pickett's charge is stopped. And this more or less this ends the battle for Lee. He's now suffered too many casualties to continue, and so he makes the decision to withdraw. Mirroring the problems that previous Union generals had had, George Meade decides not to pursue Lee and allows him to escape back into Virginia. He makes this decision because Gettysburg was such a bloody fight and he didn't think his army was ready to continue fighting. But for Lincoln, it's another example of sort of indecisiveness, and he ends up firing Meade, looking for someone, famously quoting saying he needs a general who can fight and who is willing to fight. Which brings us to the election of 1864. Gettysburg was a huge boon for Lincoln in the election of 1864 because it was a Union victory, and again Lee's attempt to invade the North failed, and so Lincoln was still able to protect Northern territory for the most part. The Democrats are going to run George McClellan, the general that Lincoln had fired earlier, on a platform of more or less reconciliation and peace, and of course you can see there's some clear racial undertones here. But the Republicans are able to attack the Democrats as being disloyal, arguing that they are more that they're traitorous and that they're more sympathetic to Southerners, whereas Lincoln, clearly the strong platform he has here, with Grant in the middle. And Republicans attack Democrats as what are called copperheads, as poisonous snakes trying to bring down the Union, whereas re-electing Lincoln will keep us on the course and keep us united as a country. And this Copperhead attack is relatively effective. Lincoln wins all the states but 3 with a resounding electoral victory. And so despite the fact that the popular vote looks somewhat close, in the end it wasn't really close. Lincoln was relatively easily re-elected, which means the war is going to continue to its ultimate conclusion. Lincoln, of course, needing a man who can fight, he turns to his obvious choice, Ulysses Grant. And so he's going to bring him east to start to see if he can grapple with Lee in Virginia. And Grant is going to launch a massive assault into Virginia with the Army of the Potomac, what's known as the Overland Campaign. And you can sort of see here he and Lee are going to be sort of chasing each other. This is one of the first examples of modern warfare where, as opposed to having sort of set-piece battles where two armies show up, they fight and they retreat, Grant is going to attack Lee, and he's going to stick with his army regardless of casualties. And so he's going to keep contact with the enemy as he chases him throughout Virginia. And as you notice here, some of these battles are categorized as Union victories, some of them are categorized as Confederate victories, but regardless, Grant is going to continue to use this strategy of attrition to push forward even after suffering, strategic losses to Lee. And he's going to use his significantly, his superior resources in order to continue to push Lee until the final siege at Petersburg and then the surrender at Appomattox. The Wilderness is the first example of this incredibly bloody battle where Grant takes massive casualties but continues pushing on. Lee is still demonstrating his tactical brilliance by having a favorable by using a favorable terrain in order to inflict heavy casualties on Grant. But as opposed to previous generals who probably would have withdrawn suffering those casualties, Grant is going to continue to fight on and continue to push Forrest Lee deeper into Virginia. This strategy of continuing to attack and continuing to press, even after suffering massive casualties, gets Grant the nickname the Butcher. And he's going to suffer significantly higher casualties than any American general has ever suffered before. And so for historians and for military history fans, there is this sort of debate about Grant, about what should be his legacy. Is he a tactically strong general, or is he simply using his superior resources to defeat Lee, who was probably a more imaginative general than Grant? And so historians still disagree about Grant's military legacy. While General Grant was grappling with Lee up in Virginia, he dispatched his second-in-command, a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman, to go and try to take cities within the Deep South with sort of the broad mandate to, quote, make Georgia howl. And so Sherman set his sights on the city of Atlanta, which was defended by a Confederate army under a General Johnston. And Sherman, after several days of advancing, was able to bring Johnson to battle, and his overwhelming numbers forced Johnson to retreat back to the city of Atlanta. As Sherman started to entrench himself around the city, Johnston realized it was hopeless and figured his only chance was to draw Sherman away, hopefully get to areas where there were more supplies, and sort of stretch out northern supply lines further. So Johnson abandoned the city of Atlanta, hoping Sherman would follow him north up into Tennessee, but Sherman did the exact opposite. First, he put the city of Atlanta to the torch, burning it down, and then Sherman started his famous advance across Georgia, what is known to us as the March to the Sea. Sherman's March to the Sea is famous because it's one of the first sort of scorched earth campaigns in American history. Sherman's goal was to march from Atlanta to Savannah, something which he accomplished in just about a month, and along the way to destroy everything of use to the enemy. So farmhouses, fields were burned, railroad tracks were pulled up, just the land was devastated as Sherman's unopposed troops spread out and made Georgia burn, and made Georgia pay for continuing to fight, with the goal being to hopefully bring a peace settlement and force the South to capitulate. This gives Sherman a sort of unique and bloody reputation in American history, and he is a hotly debated figure as far as whether or not his march to the sea was justified, and whether or not, targeting civilian infrastructure is legitimate as far as trying to bring a deadly conflict to a close. Sherman's march is also noteworthy because he was able to free a significant number of slaves, and he made some pretty important promises to them, namely that freed slaves would get access to land and resources after the war in order to be self-sufficient. Because Everyone knew that the end of the war would mean the end of slavery, but what exactly that would look like was still sort of an open question that hadn't been negotiated. And so this is often summed up as the 40 acres and a mule promise, with the idea that freed slaves would have resources and then the ability to sort of work that land and be self-sufficient. Because otherwise, I mean, freedom without the ability to support yourself is a much less sort of appealing prospect. The war itself ends at the Appomattox courthouse. Grant had Lee bottled up in the city of Petersburg for approximately a month until Lee finally decided to have a desperate breakout. And although he was able to get out of the city, Grant's army followed closely on his heels, and Lee realized it was over. And so at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee and Grant met for the first time, and apparently they talked about small things for a while and were very polite to each other and discussed the weather. And then they sat down, and Lee signed the final surrender papers, and Grant gave Lee relatively sort of generous terms, allowing his troops to take their horses home, and as long as they agreed not to fight, to go in peace. And so with that, the Civil War comes to an end, and now the really difficult job of putting the Union back together begins. And so Lincoln did have a plan for putting the Union back together. Lincoln realized, of course, that the Civil War was incredibly divisive and really bloody and just unpleasant, and so there would be a lot of hard feelings afterwards. And so his plan was a somewhat lenient plan that we call presidential reconstruction. Lincoln, first, of course, did go on a goodwill tour throughout parts of the South, where he was greeted enthusiastically by newly freed African Americans. Lincoln's proposal for peace was known as the 10% plan, because it only required 10% of a rebel state's population to swear a loyalty oath to the Union before they could be what's called reconstructed or brought back in, and then they would elect their new constitutional delegations and send them to Washington. This plan was somewhat controversial because a lot of more radical Republicans wanted the South to be formally punished, and they wanted to ban Confederate soldiers for holding office as far as, because they were traitors, and to have a majority of people take the oath. But Lincoln opposed the Wade-Davis bill, and instead what we ended up is with a plan of amnesty, where basically as long as they agree that slavery is illegal, and they swore an oath of loyalty back to the Union, Lincoln would allow them back into the Union without too much other sort of punishment. So it's a very non-punitive plan that Lincoln proposed for Reconstruction. And then Lincoln was assassinated, and everything is going to sort of change. And so at Ford's Theater, Lincoln was assassinated by a guy named John Wilkes Booth, who was an aspiring actor. Booth then apparently leapt from the presidential box, fracturing his leg but escaping. Apparently the original plan was that Booth was going to kidnap Lincoln. Booth and his conspirators were going to kidnap Lincoln and hold him hostage until the North recognized the South's independence. But of course the war ended before this could happen, and so as opposed to kidnapping him, they just assassinated him. The conspirators were eventually captured and tried and executed, but the damage was done. Abraham Lincoln is now dead, and next time we're going to look at his successor, who was a very different type of president with a very different vision, and we're going to see how the path of Reconstruction changes significantly after Lincoln's death.